I'm so tired of people saying that it's just a movie, it's just a comic book, it's just a TV show. Whatever. No, it's not. Stories are the building blocks of our culture, of ourselves, even of our own psychology. We are a product of the stories we tell ourselves about our own past and the experiences on a daily basis, but also the stories that we choose to spend time with. What types of values or feelings or whatever are they promoting? What types that we like to spend our time around? They're going to shape us. They're going to shape our personality and character, and they're going to shape our perception of the world and the acts and behaviors that we put out into the world. And people don't understand that. They go, it's just a movie. It's just this. I can like and promote whatever I want. Well, of course you can, but you should pay attention to the responsibility that you have.
Consume stories responsibly.
As a member of society, as a human being, responsibility to yourself.
Consider the consequences.
You need some balance. You need some certain criteria that is going to make sure you're promoting the right kind of works, or at least have thought through the type of work that this or that story is going to do in our culture, and then make your own decision whether or not that's something you want to support.
Consume stories responsibly. Consider the consequences. Consume stories responsibly.
There we go. Sorry, boomer moment there. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Office Hours live stream. Welcome back to the channel. Another week. Here we are. Hopefully I'm coming through in the audio. Good. Great. Coming through nicely. Good. All right. Thought I had everything set up there. Always something I miss. But welcome. If you can see, I do have the room a little bit different. Finally pushed that wall. Remember that wall behind me that was so close? So you can see things a little bit different. You probably can't tell so much with the perspective on the webcam here. But finally got it moved back to where it should be. So my office is now longer. But you can see there now. I've got the futon back there, all that good stuff. The filing cabinet and all of which used to be over there is now over there, out of camera. So there we are. A little bit different, but still the same. Welcome to everybody who's here tonight. Let's see. I did see yesterday. I set the stream up yesterday, and I haven't seen Ghost Planet Max Inc. here tonight, but maybe you're here and I just missed you in the chat. But of course, the first oh, there you are. I see you there, Ghost Planet. But of course, yesterday there was just like a wall of text of Ghost Planet having this long conversation with himself, which is always good to see. So you were technically first, Ghost Planet, though I think today, in terms of the chat, Darth Enigma shows up first. Good to see you there. Nathaniel Zaluzball, Alec Purdue, welcome. Lecture Barbarella, welcome. Eldritch Fan, Ace Moick, Leia Plus Size, Alec Purdue, I think I said that. Imaginative Hobbyist, Andre Hernandez. Welcome, everyone. Good to see everyone here. Eldritch Fan is asking, well, Eldritch Fan, you say, I'm sure you're tired of me talking about Lovecraft, but then you make a point about Lovecraft. No, see, Lovecraft is a, that's germane to the subject of the stream, right? It's not like somebody popping in here and going, yo, prof, here's the $1.99 super chat. Talk about Deadpool. What's your thoughts on Deadpool? I'm not talking about Deadpool. If you know me at all, you know I don't even like the character. So, but no, Lovecraft is actually, that's horror. It's influenced by some of the stuff we're talking about, even though Lovecraft isn't my thing. And I'm not going to be able to give you, any kind of educated answer myself. But you said you got a point here. You say, talking about Van Helsing's ancient knowledge. Oh, how Van Helsing blends ancient, not like folkloric knowledge with modern science and religion as well. You say that a lot of Lovecraft stories involve an evil Van Helsing, combining new science with ancient secrets. I think I have read a couple of his stories enough to know that much. I didn't know that was pervasive through a lot of his stories, but that's pretty cool. Yeah, I mean, Lovecraft, certainly Poe before Lovecraft. I can definitely talk about some Poe. Drew, well, Poe himself was a romantic, just an American romantic era writer. And Poe was heavily influenced by Byron. We're going to talk about that tonight a little bit. Byron, anyway. So good to see you there. Let's see. Ace Moick is meat bags. The word meat bags is Ace Moick's new term from HK47 on Star Wars: The Old Republic. Lecture Barbarella says she just bought her husband, a Frankenstein's monster for the haunted house. Is that like a figurine or a inflatable or what? But that's pretty cool. So, all right. Welcome to everybody who's here. Just making sure I'm catching up here. AL, Michael Scimbati, good to see you there. Interesting question there, Michael Scimbati. Just before we get started, asked that I see the Universal monster films first. I grew up watching, you grew up watching Jason, Michael, Freddy, but curious which I prefer. Well, I definitely prefer the Universal monsters. I'm not a big slasher movie fan in general, though I do, like I said before, I love the first Halloween film with Michael Myers. I think it's just a solid, well-done movie and a well-done monster film. The first Nightmare on Elm Street is interesting. Really like the concept, the idea, but it's starting to, it was really in the mode of slasher films that were really big. In terms of the Freddy Krueger movies, I think Wes Craven's New Nightmare is just amazing. That's a really solid film. Love the idea of it. Goes back to Gollum and the Dancing Girl, in some ways, but which is an old German expressionist silent film. But yeah, so I'm a Universal monster film guy first, but I like the Hammer horror stuff too. The Hammer versions that he did and everything. So good question. Big Al Presents goes, I hear there's a nice Universal monster page on Facebook. You're all right. You are correct. So way back when, before I even had a YouTube channel, I started these iconic Facebook pages to try to argue for the iconic versions of heroes. Superman, the iconic Superman was the first one, because all those Zack Snyder crap was out at the time, and I wanted people to know, let's try and push as much of the real deal true blue character in front of people as possible. So, a Facebook page, whatever good that did. But it was popular. It was really popular. And it got so popular that we spawned off other ones. I had people come in and help me run like an iconic Batman, iconic Wonder Woman, iconic so forth. And I think it was when Universal Monsters were trying to do their Dark Universe garbage, which was a completely wrong take on all of the characters. Fanman was the one who's like, we need an iconic Universal Monsters page. And Fanman's kind of notorious for saying, we need this, we need that, and then not acting on it. So he was like the moderator of it. But Big Al stepped in and took it over. And Big Al is just rocked that page. It's facebook.com/iconic Universal Monsters. Pretty sure that's the whole URL to it. So facebook.com/iconic Universal Monsters. And Al is always posting really cool images from the iconic Universal Monster era and period, all the different monsters and everything. So it's good stuff. Definitely check that out. All right. Oh, you got it from Bender, Smokes, from Futurama. Lecture Barbarella, thank you for the $2 super chat. He's a 7-foot prompt for your haunted house. Sweet. You guys do like a haunted house for trick-or-treaters or something, but 7-foot prop, dang, that's really cool. You'll have to send pictures of that if you wouldn't mind sending pictures. That'd be cool. I could show those on the stream. Just pictures of your haunted house or whatever. That'd be cool. Very cool. All right, making sure we're good here. So the stream tonight, maybe it's misleading a little bit. I tried to pick some cool images there for the thumbnail, and I just love Universal Monsters. Alec Ross did some amazing, images of the Universal Monsters, but I titled the stream when Dracula met Frankenstein. The description, I just left the line that's probably a little more indicative of what we're actually going to talk about, but it's the road to Dracula from Frankenstein. Now, this is probably the third video, or third stream. I'm going to cut it out as a video that I'm making in my series on monster fiction and how it affects society and monster archetypes and so forth, that I'm doing between now and Halloween. I started it with the Iconicast podcast, episode 6. And then we moved on until this point. So it's I really do recommend you go back and watch. I've actually put them together in a playlist, a monsters playlist you can find on my channel. I'll put the link out in a community post later on. So make sure you subscribe so you can see the community post. But it will have the link to the playlist in there in case anybody's missed it. And I've got the first 2 or 3. Maybe I'll put the Gothic and Haunted Summer reviews in there as well. So I do recommend watching those if you haven't caught those. I know many of you here have, but you don't have to have seen those videos to follow what I'm saying tonight. It'll just be good. It'd be great if you did, because then it's just one continuously unfolding story. But these are individual chapters too that you can still catch as we go through. So before I move on, Eldritch Fan for $4.99, thank you so much, said Myers is the best in the first movie. Yeah, I agree. He's just a human being, not supernatural. And if you watch, you see Myers as a strategist, scouting and planning. Yeah, you're absolutely right. They didn't really start the whole supernatural thing until, was it 2 or 4? I know 2, they did the whole he's the brother of thing. I think it might have been started in 2. Anyway, on the one hand, you're right. He's not a supernatural creature. On the other hand, though, he's more elemental. As the doctor says, Dr. Loomis says he's the boogeyman. He is the elemental evil, even though he's a human. It's kind of like a Joker. Calm down, Michael Schimbati. I know I just said the word Joker, but he's kind of like a Joker analog in that he is a human being, but he's a perfect representative of true elemental evil. You get the backstory of him as a child killing, and that's all I want. I think Rob Zombie really ruined the first Halloween film when he tried to give you a background into the issues that Mike Myers had as a young boy, and torturing animals. And I was going, no, stop that. John Carpenter wanted to tell a boogeyman story, and it's more shocking and more profound that any single one of us could be that boogeyman, could turn and kill your sister and then all these people or whatever. It's acknowledging the evil is within humanity. The possibility of it is there, which is something that these monster archetypes, especially once we get into the Jekyll and Hyde Wolfman, is really going to start developing for us. So yeah, good points about Halloween. It's if you haven't seen the first Halloween film, you might think, oh, I don't really like slashers. I don't want that. I don't even think there's hardly any blood in the first Halloween film. It was done in 1978. Is that it? It's considered the first slasher film, although it's nothing like what you think of as a slasher film. It's just a slasher film in the sense that there is a guy killing people with a knife, but you're not like seeing him sever somebody's head. You're not like, it's not like slasher films would become in the 80s. Very mood evoking, says a lot of interesting things about good versus evil and the nature of evil in the world. That's what I like. That's what, I don't just like a film that may or may not be a horror film because it just sort of glories in a bunch of, I'm more into terror movies is one way to parse it out. Anne Radcliffe, who I'm not crazy about, as you heard me say in the previous stream or video, but she did have a really great quote that Boris Karloff, of all people, would certainly agree with. That Boris Karloff thought of his movies not as horror films, but as terror films, meaning that he's not there just to like rip somebody's head off or whatever. That it's mood evoking, it's suspense evoking. The way Anne Radcliffe put it was basically that a terror story enhances the senses. Think about something like Edgar Allan Poe. The suspense is there. Everything's carefully crafted to create an effect. And Radcliffe would say that a terror movie enhances the soul because it's scaring you, it's terrifying you, but it's making you more aware of your own surroundings, of things in the story, of the possibilities, of the nature of good and evil and so forth. Whereas horror shrinks the soul, shrinks the senses. Horror is just how much more blood and guts can we throw at you? And oh, here's a character we haven't killed yet. Let's do that to them too. And it's just gratuitous. It's which some people like. They like the splatter movies. And I guess maybe you could say there's some sort of catharsis in it, but it's not for me. But the terms are all sort of, plastic. So, you will hear me talk about horror films and even the Universal Monster movies as the classic horror movies sometimes, because, there's just no pinned down word for this or the other. But if you really get into a good conversation of it, I would argue that they're more terror movies than they are horror films. Okay, so I am going to talk a little bit tonight about that summer in 1816 again. I know I've done a whole long video really going through that. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but we need to at least touch on it again because I want to follow the implications from that summer to what would eventually incarnate as Bram Stoker's Dracula, the great literary masterpiece we have of Bram Stoker's Dracula. And it really did get its start in that summer as well. And when I say when Frankenstein met Dracula, in a sense, Frankenstein met Dracula in that house in Switzerland in the summer of 1816. If you did watch that first video, I talked a lot about how Percy Shelley really embodied a lot of the traits of Dr. Frankenstein, that Mary Shelley would go ahead and you could tell she was influenced or inspired by a lot of the things from Percy Shelley's life. She certainly wouldn't own up to that after his death. She felt very guilty about his death. Their marriage was estranged. She was letting him go out on these ships and do these dangerous things or whatever, and he ended up dying in a shipwreck very young. She felt a lot of guilt after that and spent the rest of her life really trying to vindicate and argue for his works, try to secure his place as a great romantic poet, which he was. That's not to be denied, but he was not wasn't a great person. As I said, some of the things in that video, he grew up experimenting on his sisters with electricity because he grew up in the age of galvanism and all this kind of stuff. They were rocked by Ben Franklin still, in the previous decades. And he was very much sort of a sociopath. He saw people as there for his use. When he had all these ideas about the kind of philosophies he wanted, he married young, he married Harriet Westbrook, and then just abandoned her and their children. She ended up committing suicide over it. He blamed her family, not himself. It was just all kinds of stuff. He certainly used up Mary Shelley. I think could be argued to an extent. Certainly used her sister Claire Claremont and so forth, and so forth and so on. Now he met, in some degree, he met a kindred spirit to some degree in Lord Byron. But if Percy Shelley certainly inspired the idea of Dr. Frankenstein, then we can definitely say that Lord Byron certainly inspired the idea of the byronic vampire that would certainly go on to heavily inspire Dracula, which we'll talk about. Other things inspire Dracula too, but this is a heavy anchor point. So that summer of 1816 very much was the summer when Frankenstein met Dracula. Now, Lord Byron, he was there, and we'll talk about him there at the summer for a second, but let's talk about a little bit of what's happened to his life before he gets there. Lord Byron very much is, as I've said, and he's been described by other people as the rock star poet. You think about, even though the times were so different and the culture was so different, human beings are still human beings. And you think about young girls, how they throw themselves or get this sort of like mania over their favorite pop stars or actors or whatever. Think about the Beatlemania, for example. You can look up, Google Beatlemania or put it in YouTube, and you'll see images of them coming over to America on the Ed Sullivan Show, and women, these young teenage girls just falling all over themselves, screaming and crying, and it was Beatlemania. It was coined. The term Beatlemania was coined. Well, long before Beatlemania was there, the term Byromania was termed. Byromania, or I think it's Byromania was termed in Lord Byron's time for him. They didn't have recordings of music, so rock stars weren't necessarily a thing, but they had poets, and you could publish a poem, especially in the upper classes, widely disperse it, in a pamphlet form or book form or whatever. So these poems became the rock songs of the day, and Lord Byron, he was the rock star of that day. Percy Shelley certainly became one as well, but Lord Byron was it. And one of his dalliances, one of his lovers that he would eventually go on to marry for a time, coined the term Byromania. Women just threw themselves at him. It was just, so we'll talk more about that in a second. Now, he grew up pretty middle class. This is all during the Regency period of England. It's called the Regency period because after, if you remember Mad King George III, madness or whatever, there's more to the story of that. But he was the one who was king at the time of the American Revolution, us breaking off from Britain, King George III. Well, once he was deemed no longer fit to be king, his son, King George IV, was king, but his son wasn't old enough to actually take the crown yet. So his son was the prince, the crown prince of England, but he had a regent, that would rule, for him until he was old enough to take the crown. And so this period of history is called the Regency period in England. We see you, Alec Purdue. You're fine. He's like, where the chat's not working. You're good. Sometimes the chat repopulates or whatever, and it won't show you some of the older stuff for some reason. I don't know why. But I see you there. The Regency period is that's the famous period. It's where we like to go back for all of our little dramas like Downton Abbey, all those silly, stupid soap operas that are on TV and streaming services now. They just kind of snowball down the hill for different ones. They all go back to that Regency period because it was the period in England when the French Revolution was fresh in the memory, had just taken place, women in their umpire waist, dresses, and for the upper classes, it was, a time on the one hand, there was enough tradition still going on in Britain to have this, still aristocratic sort of caste system. And yet there were a lot of new ideas filtering in from the Enlightenment and everything still. So it's an interesting time. A lot of people like to set melodramatic soap operas during that time period because you can have all of the fun and the pomp and circumstance of the dress and the culture, but you can also introduce the scandalous affairs and, all that kind of stuff that television likes to do. So that's the era, just if you're thinking about trying to picture it in your mind. And Lord Byron's middle class, his mother was actually from a wealthy family, but she was somewhat disowned because she married Lord Byron's father, who was a ship captain, I believe, sort of a lower class ne'er-do-well. He ended up abandoning them, was in exile for a time for crimes and stuff like that. So Lord Byron, basically, his name was George Gordon. Growing up, he just grew up with his mother. So little George Gordon grew up with his mother, middle class, when he was, and didn't have a lot of money. When he was 8 years old, though, his uncle died, and his uncle was the Lord Byron. So his uncle, because there were no heirs or whatever, the lordship came to young George Gordon, and young George Gordon became Lord Byron. Part of that was he inherited this abbey, this old, ruined shambles of an abbey in this land. But the ruins weren't good enough for him to live in. They weren't, stable or safe for anybody to live in. So on the one hand, he's got this lordship, he's Lord Byron, but it doesn't necessarily come with a ton of money. It's just sort of this title inherited. So he's still, he's not poor, he's not Dickensian poverty or anything, but he's moving in circles that are aristocratic circles of the time, but with a very low income. But he is able to make it into Trinity College in Cambridge. He wanted to go to Oxford, but he makes it to Cambridge. Even growing up, though, before then, he holds these lavish parties at this ruins of this abbey, and he's these drunken debaucheries with women, half dressed, running around and stuff like that. He's Lord Byron, from the very start. He gets into college. He gets into a little trouble at college because his bisexual tendencies start to come out. Now, on the one hand, that's enough to get you in trouble at that time period. I mean, homosexual activity was a capital offense. You could be hanged for being found out as a homosexual. It wasn't commonly done. It was more of a scandalous if your enemies were against you kind of thing, or if it was too open. Of course, there were a lot of people dalliances and this and that back then. But Lord Byron was he was going after these young boys, these like young altar boys and whatnot. I mean, it's very much what we would just openly call pedophilia today, though they may or may not have necessarily called it that back then. So it's pretty twisted. He'll just sleep with anything, and wants the shock value. He eventually leaves. He's able to leave on his grand tour, which a lot of young aristocrats in Britain at the time, part of a coming of age for them, they leave college and they would go on this grand tour of Europe, of the continent, and see all these places, kind of completing the humanities education and whatnot. And it was seen as kind of a place for young men to go off and sort of sow their wild oats. It was their last stage of childhood before they would come back to Britain and then go into their profession or, go into manhood or something like that. Well, when he's out there touring Britain, he writes the first epic poem that becomes really big for him, the Pilgrimage of Childe Harold. Child is a title that means sort of like knight. So the Pilgrimage of Childe Harold, which is very much an autobiographic poem. It's very much about him, but it's also romanticized and all these, battles and so forth and such. And he gets back to Britain, and that poem just makes him hugely famous, just immediately. Like, women are throwing themselves at him. He does get this reputation for using women up, scandalizing young women, ruining their reputations and so forth. In fact, young women are encouraged not to look him in the eye because it's believed that he has sort of a mesmerist effect on women. If he can catch your eye, he hypnotizes you. He was, by all accounts, incredibly good looking. He had this very alabaster complexion. He was very vain, very concerned with how he appeared in photographs and everything like that. But he was also born with a club foot, so he did have a noticeable limp. He was always taking sort of liquid diets and things like that to keep himself thin, because it was especially the Romantic poet era. The more emaciated you were, the more beautiful and otherworldly, you were, or whatever. But he was somebody, his body's genetically was given to kind of putting on some weight here and there. So he was constantly, keeping the weight off and just really obsessed with his appearance, insecure about his club foot, of course. But he was the ladies' man by all accounts. But his money's still a problem for him. Money's still a problem for him. He's writing all these poems and everything's great. He's having all these dalliances, all these affairs with women and men. Money's still an issue for him, so it comes to the point where he really should get married. He should marry a wealthy woman. That's what society tells him, so that he can maintain his lifestyle. Now, his mother passes away. It's kind of sad. He comes back from his grand tour just in time to find out that his mother's deathly ill, and he's rushing to be with her, but she dies before he gets there. So he's got this sort of mother issue kind of thing going on. He eventually meets his half-sister from his father's side, they hadn't grown up or anything. So he meets her, and then he decides, oh, I'll go ahead and have an affair with her. So he has an affair with his sister. By some accounts, he gets her pregnant. It's starting to be sort of an open scandal. One of the women that he had an affair with was a lady, Carolyn Lamb, who was very smitten with him and went a little psycho when he left her. And she called him famously mad, bad, and dangerous to know. That's the quote, the slogan that gets thrown around for Lord Byron a lot. He ruined her reputation quite a bit. She wrote, some things about him and scandalized him and whatnot. He eventually does marry this one woman for her money. But while he marries her, he lets his sister come live with them and continues the affair with his sister there at his wife's home. By many accounts, flaunting it in front of his wife even. So it's pretty twisted. He does have a child with his wife, a daughter, whom he just abandons. Eventually, he and his wife are separated, estranged. Her family is threatening to go public with his incest, with his many scandals of the women and stuff like that, which would ruin him publicly. And he's very worried about that because he's all about his reputation and so forth, even though he likes the idea of being the rogue poet, rock star, bad boy. So he has to flee. He has to flee Britain at this time because of all the scandal with his sister. With that, he abandons his wife, his daughter, goes back to Switzerland, particularly Switzerland, where he can still live his lifestyle as he wants. And he's still writing. He's still immensely popular during all this time period. And it's in the home. It's this old villa, the Villa Diodati, I think is the name of it. Might have the pronunciation wrong. But it was actually a place where John Milton used to stay. John Milton of Paradise Lost, which is pretty fitting. So Lord Byron is staying there, and that's when he invites Percy Shelley, Mary Shelley, and Mary Shelley's sister, Claire Claremont, who Percy Shelley himself is having a little menage a trois with, to come and stay with him. He brings along this physician, his personal physician by the name of John Polidori. Lord Byron brings this physician by the name of John Polidori, who was a brilliant young man. John Polidori his parents were Italian immigrants to Britain, Catholics, because of that. He's brilliant. He graduates college with a medical degree long before typically many people do, but you have to be a certain age. You have to be like 20, like mid-20s or something like that in England to actually open up a law practice and study law in England, or study, medicine, not law, medicine in England. Well, he's too young for that. So Lord Byron's family hires him to go along with Lord Byron as his personal physician, make sure he doesn't go out and kill himself or anything like that. So young Polidori, and these are all people in their 20s, accompanies Lord Byron. And Polidori is very much starstruck by Lord Byron. And especially when Lord Byron has Percy and Mary and Claire Claremont all in there. They're these, brilliant artistic minds coming together for this summer. And John Polidori is very much the odd man out. He wants so badly to be one of them, but he didn't quite have the artistic talent that the others did. And Lord Byron very much treated him that way. Lord Byron liked to watch people squirm. He liked to watch people in pain, but then keep them from, crossing the edge or whatever, but still, so this is, a pretty toxic relationship he's got with this young man, Lord Byron. Maybe there's a homosexual thing going. Maybe there's not. We don't really know that for sure. Wouldn't surprise me at all. But anyway, Lord Byron, while they're there that summer, he has gotten Claire Claremont, Mary Shelley's half-sister, he has gotten her pregnant. He tells her that she can either go off and have the child without him, but if she wants him to acknowledge the child, then she has to give him the baby and never see the baby again. Pretty cruel, pretty heartless, pretty, because he doesn't like it when women try to lay claims on him. He won't be claimed by any one woman, right? He likes to claim as many women as he can, but no woman claims him. He's very predatory. So Claire Claremont, as heartbreaking as it is, she eventually agrees to this, thinking that her child, as the recognized child of a lord, would have a much easier life. So she begs him to take good care of the child or whatever. He ends up abandoning the child at like 3 years old in a convent, and the poor child dies at like 5 or 6. It's very sad, very heartbreaking. But this is the kind of person Lord Byron was. Very sociopathic, very. He liked to have the reputation of being sort of the champion of the lower class. He gave a few speeches in the House of Lords, about the working class occasionally, and he liked to, sort of be seen as the one who's a Robin Hood-like character. But, personally, he wasn't at all. This is just he's very obsessed with his appearance. Of course, during this summer, the famous, I've talked about it before, challenge goes out. They're reading Percy, Lord Byron, Mary Shelley, all of them, Polidori. They're reading the Phantasmagoria, which is this German collection of haunted ghost stories. And it's a stormy summer, as I've said, a darker summer, a cooler summer, very stormy because of this volcano that's erupted in Europe previously. So it's called the year without a summer even. But during all these storms and tumultuous summer, these dark nights, these storms, they challenge each other to write ghost stories. And of course, Mary Shelley would eventually write Frankenstein. Lord Byron starts to write a vampire story-ish because vampires are known in sort of the folkloric level at that point. Lord Byron plays with the idea of a vampire who is a part of society, not just a decrepit corpse that rises from their grave at night to feed on people just to crawl back in their grave before daylight, but an actual member of high society. He toys with the idea a little bit, never really develops it, doesn't do anything with it. Okay, during that summer, as you know, many people are estranged. Claire Claremont's estranged from Lord Byron. He boots her. He fires John Polidori. So John Polidori leaves, pretty upset about the whole thing, have been treated horribly. And John Polidori takes this story that Lord Byron told that night and develops it himself into a pretty solid little novella. It's called The Vampires. It's Vampyre, The Vampire, The Vampire, if you want to, just say that to remember the spelling of it. And eventually that's published. By some accounts, it's published without his knowledge. It's mistakenly attributed to Lord Byron, that Lord Byron wrote it. Some people think that might have been a publicity stunt. But no, it's eventually cleared up. Lord Byron disowns it, and John Polidori, claims it. It's his. And so it is his work. He wrote it, and he deserves credit for that. This story, The Vampire, really it's the first thing in popular culture that takes the idea of these vampires, these decrepit zombie-like creatures or ghost-like creatures, depending on the folktale that you get, where you hear it from, takes these creatures and makes them, what if they were a member of society? What if they were Lord so-and-so? So instead of Lord Byron, Polidori is heavily writing The Vampire based on Lord Byron. He's remembering what it was like to travel with this guy. So in the story of The Vampire, you've got a young man who's very optimistic and has a very romantic look on the world. And you get him falling into step with this Lord Ruthven, or Lord Ruthven, depending on how you want to pronounce it, who is ruthless, right? Who is horrible at uses up women, scandalizes them, and so forth. But this young man has a romanticized view of him, and they go on the grand tour together of Europe. So you can see the parallels between John Polidori and Lord Byron here in a heartbeat. And it's a classic story. I won't ruin the ending. There's a really cool little plot that goes on. It's pretty horrifying. But basically, this Lord Ruthven is just proving to be Lord Byron in the sense that he's using people up. He's preying on people, women and so forth in particular. So it's a fascinating story because it takes that vampire character and really says, like, think about what if Lord Byron was a vampire? And the implications on culture for that are the vampire is suddenly somebody in society, somebody that can live in the house next to you, right? It's not a corpse crawling out of the graveyard and breaking into your house. It's somebody in high society, somebody at the party that you're at, that kind of thing. And that was a big deal. And it really started the byronic vampire idea. And, at this point, in terms of vampire fiction, you have the folkloric vampire, who is the type I was just talking about, the corpse rising from the grave, that kind of thing, of the different stories in Bulgaria and such and so forth. Then you also had, so you got the folkloric vampire, you've got the dangerous woman vampire. Think of that can technically be pointed going all the way back to Christabel, Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Christabel, which we talked about a little bit in that first video. Carmilla, Le Fanu's Carmilla is published at this time too. And it's these stories, the Dangerous Woman vampire story, they go back to the kind of warning stories that were out there for a while. Like there'd be stories, trying to like scare young men or women, as the case may be, in terms of the story, into good behavior. So like there's a common story, for example, that a young man, this is out throughout Europe and whatnot, a young man sees this beautiful woman, kind of falls in with her this evening, and eventually has lets her come over to his house. They sleep together, scandalous, pre-sex, premarital sex with this woman. And then he wakes up in the morning, instead of finding a beautiful naked woman next to him, he finds a decrepit old woman's corpse, which he has slept with that night, So it's a terrifying story, right? But the moral is, of course, pay attention to who you're staying around and what you do around them, because you never know, who you could be falling under the spell of, only to find out the reality of them later, and so forth, So the Dangerous Woman story kind of goes back to that old tradition of stories, but it eventually incarnates as a vampire in a lot of stories. So we've got the folkloric vampire, the Dangerous Woman vampire. There are also a source of stories that come about where there's a vampire-like force. It's called the unknown vampire. And it might be like there's a story about a vampire-like plant. There's a story about vampire-like creatures, like sort of chimerical-like creatures or whatever. Vampiric worms, vampiric different things like that. So that's a tradition as well. So we have the folkloric vampire, the Dangerous Woman vampire, the unknown vampire, and then you have the byronic vampire, which is that sort of Lord Byron-like character. This is not something that's exclusive to the idea of vampires. With Lord Byron, and in that era, and because of the persona of Lord Byron, and because of his fiction as well, there was a type of character that developed called just the Byronic hero. I've talked about this before on the channel a while ago. And the Byronic hero runs rampant through 19th century literature in particular, the 1800s, because Byron here is at the end of the 1700s, and the character just takes effect. A lot of Russian, authors take this, Turgenev, Lermontov. It's a common character that you see in a lot of 1800s fiction. The Byronic hero is somebody characterized as they're young, they're very, they're wealthy, they're aristocratic, and they're just bored with society. They're bored with the traditions, they're bored with the values, they're bored with all of that stuff. Nothing has anything of value or substance to offer them, and they tend to use people up quite a bit, depending on the story. That's sort of the basic Byronic trope, and then you can go different places with it. So there was a Byronic hero that was a big deal, and it certainly took place in terms of the Byronic vampire. A lot of stories out there with the Byronic vampire, poems, but they really do all trace back to John Polidori's The Vampire, or The Vampire, if you want to just say that so you can remember the spelling, which is based on Lord Byron. Alec Purdue for a $5 super chat there. Thank you, sir. So correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't the Dangerous Woman vampire which inspired the story Elizabeth Bartley? Do you mean Elizabeth Bathory? Or Elizabeth Bartley is the character that inspired the story, which goes back to Elizabeth Bathory. Elizabeth Bathory was a countess who it was known for. She was from Transylvania, that area too. I forget the exact geographical location, but she believed that if she bathed in the blood of young women, that she would herself remain young. And she was a countess going after these peasant women, and it's believed that she was responsible for the murders of thousands. I mean, because she was the countess, she could just bring women in every night if she wanted, the deaths of these young women. So of course, vampire stories started about Countess Bathory, and that goes, that's part of what you can definitely trace back that Dangerous Woman to, certainly. So yeah. Yeah, Countess Bathory was a real person, Alec. Yeah, definitely. There's so many different interesting stories that have been based on Countess Bathory. There's one that I'll just say because I heard about it and thought, well, that's crap. I think I watched it just so I could be sort of a completionist and watch everything in this one little franchise thing. But I was pleasantly surprised by it. When I was watching Fright Night movies a while back and doing the reviews of them on my channel, of course, the great Fright Night, that was um, Tom Holland's original Fright Night from the 80s, great. Chris Sarandon, Roddy McDowall, wonderful, classic. They did a sequel, which wasn't Tom Holland coming back to it, but it's still worth watching. It's still Roddy McDowall returns, and it's fun. Then, of course, they did the remake of Fright Night. Was it 2012, 13, or something like that? I don't know. Which had Colin Firth and those people. What's his name? Dave Tennant. Which is fun. It's a different take on it. It's fun. It's nothing like the classic. It's nothing like the original, but it's fun. If you like the Fright Night, if you like vampire movies, it's fun. Definitely watch it. But then a few years later, there's a movie that came out. I think it was direct to DVD, and it was called Fright Night 2. And so a lot of people thought, okay, this is a remake. If the Fright Night of like the 2010 or 11 or whatever was a remake of the 80s Fright Night, well, maybe this new movie called Fright Night 2 is supposed to be a remake of the sequel they did in the 80s to Fright Night. But it's not. I don't know why it was called Fright Night 2. It's actually a re-envisioning of the original Fright Night story. It doesn't even take place in any of the continuity from the remake of a few years prior. It's a re-envisioning of the Fright Night story with the Countess Bathory as sort of the inspiration for the vampire instead of Count Dracula as the inspiration for the vampire. Now, Fright Night was never about Count Dracula. It was a vampire, his own vampire, and you can read the novelizations, Tom Holland stuff to get more of the story back there. But it was still based. It was like, what if Dracula was your next door neighbor? That was the plot. That was the basic idea of the plot of Fright Night. Well, this one is, what if Countess Bathory is your European exchange art professor? And it, believe it or not, it's pretty interesting. It's not going to win any awards for the greatest film ever made. Certainly not. It's a direct-to-DVD movie. But that premise makes it an interesting exploration of vampire lore. Certainly does. So that, you just brought Countess Bathory up, and that made me think of that one example, but a lot of different tellings. Certainly Carmilla would be influenced by Countess Bathory. I don't know if Christabel was necessarily influenced by Countess Bathory. Christabel, it's its own kind of thing, its own sort of Coleridge kind of thing. But anyway, Eldridge fan, he's got another series in Tim Powers' Hide Me Among the Graves. Haven't seen that. Is that another Countess Bathory influenced one? Haven't seen that. Yeah, Dear Son of Graver, the teacher villain or villainess is a great trope. Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. And that movie does it dang well. It does some really cool things with vampires as well, in that it and I'm sure this has been done before, but like she's in pursuit of these, these kids who are running away from her, and they were running through tunnels, like they drop into like the manhole and they're running through like the sewers or whatever. She drops down and starts doing echolocation, because bat-like vampires or whatever. It was really interesting. They did some really cool visuals, some cool things in that movie that shocked me. I wasn't expecting it in a little direct to DVD remake of a remake's sequel-ish re-envisioning of original or whatever, But it was interesting. It was interesting. Okay, so we're going to do an actual video on Dracula, really going in depth into Dracula. But I just want to say a few things about Dracula as the end point of our trajectory here, because we're talking about the road to Dracula from Frankenstein, which certainly takes us through Percy Shelley and Lord Byron there, takes us through Polidori. And we just talked about the 4 types of vampire stories that were about at that time, and certainly were about at the time that Bram Stoker starts to write, which were, once again, the folkloric vampire, the dangerous woman vampire, the unknown force vampire, and the byronic vampire. Bram Stoker takes all 4 of those inspirations and kind of rolls them into Count Dracula. And there's a lot to Count Dracula, okay? We're going to spend more time going into that in its own video. There's a lot to Bram Stoker's research and the ideas, but I'll just say this one thing. It's the entwining of all 4 of those stories. And a lot of people don't realize that, because a lot of the adaptations of Dracula that we've seen, especially the 1931 Universal horror film with Bela Lugosi, classic, wonderful, great movie. but that really drew on the Byronic hero, Byronic vampire aspect of Dracula, and kind of played that up even more so than the others. And a lot of the vampire stories we've had since then are really just heavily drawing on the Byronic, perhaps none more than the Interview with the Vampire stories. So the Byronic vampire really did kind of rise above a lot of the rest of them to be the most prominent vampire even after Dracula. But the original Dracula story wasn't that. There was some of the Byronic vampire in Dracula, in that he was a member of society. He purchases a house next to you, that's terrifying and stuff. So there's some of that, but there's also a lot of the other stuff, and there's really interesting things that Stoker's doing in that novel. But the last thing I'll say about that is that, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about Bram Stoker, but Bram Stoker himself, like John Polidori, was sort of playing second string to this bully he kind of idealized. Like Polidori being hired as Lord Byron's, personal physician assistant, Bram Stoker was famously the theater manager for a famous actor by the name of Henry Irving, a stage actor. And he was a theater manager of the Lyceum, which was this famous theater. And Henry Irving was, in many ways, a very Dracula-like character. A lot of people say, oh, but Stoker and Irving were such great friends. And sure, you might say that. But Irving was also very domineering, would openly put you down, if it suited his, reputation and so forth. So you had the culmination, the great literary masterpiece of a vampire work that we have in Dracula comes from an individual in this sort of toxic relationship with a friend, much the same way that the original novella that inspired him, in many ways, the vampire did, of John Polidori, in the shadow of this toxic, Lord Byron. So it's an interesting little counterpiece there. Another really interesting connection is that Lord Byron himself stayed in Europe because it's just too scandalous for him to return to England. And he eventually went to Greece, and he kind of fell in with some people in Italy and Greece, Venice and whatnot. And he fell in with the Greece cause, this romantic cause of the Greeks trying to win their independence from the Islamic Empire, the Muslims. So you have, they actually made Lord Byron, was it a colonel or somebody, like a commander in the army somehow, fighting the Islamic invasion of Greece. And he became sort of a romantic hero because of that. Eventually he died, not in battle, but from a fever he caught, just like walking on the beach or whatever. So not a very noble end. But he died and was romanticized as this great hero. Greece still romanticizes him as a hero. Britain, they held these great, massive funeral processions for him, when he passed and whatnot. Yet he was also this horrific character who would prey upon people. He famously had a skull of a dead monk that he made into a chalice to drink his wine out of. I mean, he would just do anything like that to shock people. And yet he's romanticized, too, in some places as some great hero. And now you can think about the connection there to Vlad Tepes, the Vlad Dracul, the original historic figure that Bram Stoker took the name from to use as his character, was also somebody who is famous in some places as the great liberator, the one who was fighting the Muslims, that fighting Islam back from Eastern Orthodox Christianity or Catholic Christianity there in some places and so forth. So, just an interesting little connection there. Pretty fascinating. So I'm going to stop the main talk there, but we'll get into the chat there and see what some people have to say. But it's really fascinating stuff. We're continuing our journey from the Gothic literature and looking at the Enlightenment and its influences for the worse, certainly in Europe. But the ways that these two, so far we're only on the two archetypes, the vampire and the Frankenstein, but the ways that these two monster archetypes emerged out of the tensions, guilt, and fears that surrounded a lot of those Enlightenment ideals and their applications, specifically applications in Europe. Pretty fascinating. Now, eventually we're going to get to our trinity of monster archetypes. So you Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Wolfman. Those are just like the main trinities, because underlying each of them is the real tensions and the real thing that makes them continue to pop up over and over and over again in slightly different incarnations, slightly different versions, and so forth. And the Wolfman, in terms of literary masterpieces, you can trace back to Robert Louis Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde. Not technically a werewolf story, but the same duality of man principle there. You can eventually look to things like Werewolf of Paris with Guy Endor and so forth, and other things. But of course, Stevenson writes The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde between Frankenstein and Dracula, all still in that Regency into the Victorian era. This is where the tensions are rife and the culture is ready to really incarnate these monster archetypes in a way that can speak to us of the horrors, of the warnings, of the tensions, of the thrills, in such an archetypal way that is still with us today throughout the centuries. So it's pretty fascinating there. And we'll continue our journey with that as we go between now and Halloween. Samuel Proctor said, my first version of Dracula was Hotel Transylvania, the funny and overprotective father who hides from humans because they burned his wife. Hotel Transylvania is such a great, funny film. I told Sound Engravers, this is one you can watch. You can watch Hotel Transylvania with me. What a great cast, too. Ed Begley Jr., Jeff Goldblum, Michael Richards, Gina Davis, Carol Kane. So many others. Jeffrey Jones, of course. Just so funny. Such a great film. 80s horror comedy, my dear Sound Engraver, popping the link to her stream tomorrow. She's going to be with us, probably 5:45ish, something like that, 5:30, 5:45ish. So do check out her stream tomorrow. She's going to be talking about some interesting things. Oops. Yeah, that's disturbing, using a skull as a bong, not a bong, but a chalice for his wine. Oh, that's as disturbing as using a skull as a bong. Yeah. And I think it's stories differ as to where he got the skull. Some say he dug it up from the abbey that he was technically, was his property. But yeah, he took this old monk's skull and made it into a wine chalice, and it was just part of his allure, part of his image. Look how shocking I am. I drank my wine from a human skull. Which again fits him perfectly into the Dracula type. Definitely. Chat jumped him behind on the chat there. Oh, 499. Thank you, Eldritch Fan, for another super chat. Off topic, but what Star Wars book are you reading next? I'm very interested in your take on Children of the Jedi. It's got some interesting prequel ideas. I haven't gotten anywhere near that yet. I am going to, I don't know which one I'm going to read next. I'm really digging the monster stuff right now, and that's where all my reading kind of energies are going now. It probably will be sort of November before I jump into some more Star Wars. I never finished the X-Wing Chronicles, or the X-Wing books. So that's one thing I might go back to. I might jump right into, I don't know, maybe Jedi Academy, maybe Tatooine Ghost. I don't know. I'll let you know, though, when I do, and I'll certainly be doing content on it, I'm just really digging the whole monster thing right now because Son Engraver and I were talking, about YouTube in general, and I firmly stand behind all the things I've talked about on my channel, like the heroic archetypes, and I'll be returning. I still talk about superheroes and heroic archetypes. But as I've said before, the fight against the woke has just become its own sort of prepackaged money-making machine for people who do those channels now. It's not sincere. There's no integrity to it. It's just, guys, Disney, am I right? Click subscribe. It's just like, that's all it is to it, and how many times can you hear that over and over again? And I will talk about issues of heroic fiction and archetypes. And I mean, that's based my channel on. I'm still here talking about archetypes in literature, just doing monsters right now. But it's so immensely satisfying to me. It's far more fulfilling, even though this monster stuff doesn't really get tons of views. I mean, if I was doing a Deadpool stream right now, I'd have 100 in here easily. Saturday night talking about Deadpool. Oh my God, But no one's saying anything of substance about it. They're just parroting the things the other channels have said. And your average YouTube viewer is an imbecile. I'm just going to say that. Now, obviously, I'm not talking about you guys who are here watching me, because you're watching, some sort of content, not necessarily you're watching me, but you're watching content that's not necessarily the mainstream, parroting this, and that. But I mean, just your average person who tunes into YouTube is like your average Jerry Springer viewer. They want the drama, they want the this and that, and I couldn't really feel good about myself if I was just pandering to the mainstream YouTube algorithm. There are some channels that have somehow broke into the niche of their own expertises. Think about like Jonathan Pajot or something like that. Who talk about their thing and they're wildly successful for it. So it can be done, but for the most part, it's way more fulfilling for me. I've gotten a few comments talking about this monster fiction stuff. I had a few comments from people saying, "Wow, I never realized this. Thanks for talking about this. This is really interesting." That is so much more fulfilling to me as a teacher than doing a video about, guys, did you see what Disney Star Wars did next? And having people go, "Yeah, prof, Disney's so woke." Like I'm just talking to a bunch of Neanderthals, beating the same drum, not really trying to change anything, just trying to feel some sort of sense of belonging around the tribal fire. And a few witch doctors have popped up and learned the right things to say to get them to cast their pearls and so forth before them. That's what YouTube is. So I'm much happier doing this kind of stuff. Which isn't to say that I'm done with superheroes. No, I'm sticking to what my channel was at the beginning, which is archetypes, heroic archetypes, monstrous archetypes, whatever, literary stuff, the stuff that came from my scholarship and in my my classes. And I'm having a blast with it. Private Eye in retrospect. Know the feeling, Prof. Just made a video about a terrible Uncle Scrooge comic that nobody talked about. Not many views, but wanted to take that off my chest. Yeah, I mean, that's the beauty of YouTube, I think. And that's where I think it's fun and it's still worth watching, is where you do have just people, YouTube started as the great equalizer. Anybody with a phone could make a video and get their opinion out there. And then it either became popular or it didn't or whatever, but they were saying something meaningful that meant something to them. But then it soon became, it was just a matter of time before it became a place for people to prey upon others. Let's do what, let's give them what they want to hear. Let's manufacture a little drama over here. Oh, this is pretty interesting. This is a cultural thing that's happening. Let's drum that up and let's, pretend that we're the soldiers fighting for that or whatever, Yeah. But definitely Star Wars content's returning because I love the EU. When it comes to Star Wars content, for me, it's all about, as you said, Eldritch fan, get the EU. And I've got so much to read one day. Children of the Jedi, I'm having trouble kind of placing that right now in terms of where it falls in the continuity, because there's a lot I haven't read with the EU, but I have a blast. Every novel I read, even if it's one that I don't like quite as much as another one, it's still just so fun to be in the universe. And that's the great thing about the EU, is that even when you stumble across a novel that maybe isn't all that great or really isn't, up to snuff with some of the other ones, you at least know that you're reading a novel by somebody who dearly loves the Star Wars universe. And for the most part, really does respect it. It's not like Disney's crap, Disney's continuity, whatever. You're not getting somebody who just wants to preach a message on the platform that you tune into, So, I don't know. Alec Purdue, thank you, sir. That's a very generous super chat. I very much appreciate it. For $20, thank you so much. Said, while we're still on the subject of Frankenstein, do you think you'll do any sort of commentary on how modern mascot horror ties back to Frankenstein? Franchises like Poppy Playtime and Hello Puppets. Okay, so I don't know these titles, Poppy Playtime and Hello Puppets. But French mascot horror, do you mean kind of like that's a sweet super chat, and I want to make sure you get your money's worth. So let me look up. Just want to make sure I know what you mean by mascot horror. Poppy Playtime. Is this kind of thing like Freddy's Fright Night at Freddy's, that kind of thing? I think this is what it is. Yeah. How do they relate back to Frankenstein? All right, so I'm just kind of going right now off the seat of my pants here, with your question here. Frankenstein's a little bit more expansive in that we're dealing with anxieties of science and so forth, and Enlightenment ideals and whatnot. They're still with us today. I don't know a lot about Five Nights at Freddy's, but I know basic principle of it is, what if you went into one of those places like Showbiz Pizza or Chuck E. Cheese's or whatever, and what if the animatronics were actually coming out to get you, which is a great concept, which is something that, every child has thought of or whatever, which is a great concept, even though I haven't really followed it a lot. I do think you could make a link between the mascot horror, like you said there, in Frankenstein, in the sense that we have this this over the top, overly exaggerated character, whether it's a corpse sewn together or a literal character sewn together from fabrics or whatnot. And it is a creation too, right? It's an animatronic creation or a character creation that comes to life and seeks after people. So I don't know. I'd have to think about that. It's interesting. You asked me if I'll ever do it. I hadn't planned on it, but you've made me curious about it now. So I'll certainly look into it for you. Thank you for the super chat, and thank you for the interesting question. I'll definitely look into that a little bit more. All right. Oh, cool. Ace Moic, you and your pals on your channel are going to do a discussion of Revan, the Revan book. That's good. Yeah, we talked about that some. That's a great one. Sure, I'm just kind of wrapping things up here as I'm starting to slow down. Oh, Darth Enigma talking about Star Wars Republic. You mean there's a novel called Star Wars Republic? Because I'm definitely in the Star Wars Republic era. Yeah, better than Dave Filoni's Clone Wars. Oh, also, of course, yeah. Let's see. Just wrapping things up, making sure I didn't miss anything. I mean, of course, you guys made so many great comments and chats throughout the night. Sorry I couldn't get to everybody's, obviously, but I think we covered what we wanted to cover, which is good. Let's see. Alec Purdue talking about could be worse, could be a heel turn like you've always said. I haven't followed him in forever. What is he? Is he talking about something different now than what he used to talk about? I don't know. I still think of him as Diversity in Comics. I know he changed his name to something, but I don't know what it is. Imagine if Hobbyist said here, in some reinterpretation of Dracula, they tie his origins to religion, such as in the version starring Gerard Butler, but he's originally a Judas Iscariot. What are your thoughts? Those are fascinating iterations. I'm not against those at all. I think it's only natural. Stoker didn't research the character of Lad Tepes and really base his character on him. Stoker already had the idea of the story. He was looking for a name, and he found this historical figure, which worked. Let's link it to that. So I think it's only natural that people would go back and try to draw out more inspiration from Vlad the Impaler's life to link to this and that. And you do have somebody in the character of Vlad the Impaler who's supposedly a convert to Christianity, and yet is doing all these monstrous things, which perhaps isn't so different than many other rulers of the time here and there in certain places. But I think it only begs that connection to be made. So yeah, I like a lot of the even Bram Stoker's Dracula, the Francis Ford Coppola film, which isn't true to the novel like the name claims, but it did a great, fascinating origin for Dracula, being that he'd made a deal with the devil basically to get revenge or his true love dying or so forth, or to try to save her or something. I forget the details right off the top of my head. But I like that kind of stuff, or the idea that Dracula himself is Judas Iscariot reincarnated or whatever. I'm glad that's not the tale that gets retold, but for a story here and there, we can explore that. That's the cool thing about these monster archetypes is that, I'm looking at the original versions, and we're going to go follow it through at least as far as the universal incarnations and how that's kind of continued to influence our culture today. But that's the thing about a good, solid archetype at its creation, is that it's so packed full of DNA that it continues to unfold, throughout the centuries even. So yeah, good stuff. I think there's one more super chat here before I go. Nathaniel's Lowsball. Someone in the chat asked if characters like Michael, Jason, and Freddy would translate well in the Victorian era alongside Dracula, and the rest in an Elseworlds tale or a reimagining. No, they wouldn't translate well, but you can do anything in an Elseworlds tale, and you could make it fun. I mean, if you can put Batman in Gotham by Gaslight, Victorian era, some of them you could certainly, it'd be really fun to see like a Victorian version of Freddy or something like that. It would just be an interesting what if story. They wouldn't necessarily translate well because slasher villains are a product of the culture that they came about in. They're very much linked to that 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s, this culture. And that's where they came from. That's the anxieties, that's the tensions that they spoke to and continue to speak to. Those are still made today. So while it'd be fascinating, and I'd love to see a story if it was done well, trying to place one of them back in that era or something like that. Yeah, heck, I'd read that, if it was, just to see what it was like. But no, they wouldn't translate well. It wouldn't just naturally click. It wouldn't, it'd just be sort of a fun what if. But good question. Thanks for grabbing that question, and thanks to whoever originally asked that question, because obviously I can't catch everything, and appreciate the support as always. All right, so gonna go ahead and wrap up then now at my my usual mark. But been a blast tonight hanging out with you guys. A lot of good, it's just so much food for conversation with these things. So I'm going to continue the series with next week's live stream. I haven't decided exactly what angle or how I'm going to proceed, but we're continuing our progress. And as we go towards Halloween, inevitably towards all of these three, we've only covered two so far. Maybe we'll jump into Jekyll and Hyde / Wolfman next week. I don't know. We'll see. But we'll keep it coming. And you guys bring in your horror questions. Yeah, Jack the Ripper will be discussed when we talk about Jekyll and Hyde. Absolutely. So yeah, whether it's Lovecraft or whether it's slasher movies or mascot horror, which I didn't even realize was a name until until Alec Purdue dropped that. I'm glad I know that now. Yeah, bring up all those things, and because it's all linked. The roots of popular horror fiction all come from the summer of 1816, but certainly from these three archetypes. So we'll be doing more of that. So thank you guys always for the support. Appreciate it. Thanks for hanging out with me. It was a lot of fun. But until next time, keep enjoying and digging deeper into the true blue monster stories you love. Thanks for watching.